Hey everyone, this is the MCAT Guru. On today's video, I want to talk about how to break down science questions. If you haven't watched my previous video on breaking down science passages, make sure to go back and watch that video before watching this one because this is a continuation of those ideas, and I'll be using the same passage as I used in that previous video. Additionally, I would recommend watching my video on general strategies for breaking down MCAT questions before this one as well. Before I bring the questions up, I want to talk about the general workflow behind answering a science question. So when you read the science question, first ask yourself, is this a passage information question or a basic science question? If you recognize that you're going to need the passage to answer the question, you then should ask yourself, is the answer going to come from a figure? If the answer is yes, go to that figure or table, analyze the data, and answer the question. However, if you recognize that it's not coming from the figure, then you're going to need to go back to the text to find your answer. Now remember, based on the way that we've broken down this passage, you should be able to immediately recognize which paragraph the answer should be found in. Even if you don't remember the detail exactly, that's okay, but you know where to go find it. Now, if you recognize that the answer is not in the passage, this is likely a basic science question, and you're going to have to answer this using your own background knowledge. Now, that being said, most of the time, the basic science questions, which basically act like standalones in a passage, are going to reference the passage, whether they're referencing a structure or some detail mentioned, something like that. But ultimately, the answer itself is not going to be found in the passage. You're going to have to use your knowledge of the subject to actually answer the question. I now want to show you how to use the basic science and passage information chart to answer questions effectively. Now, I previously showed you the workflow on how to identify if it's a basic science or passage information question. Now, the basic science questions are typically going to come from this basic science topics list that we've already identified from the passage. And the passage information questions are typically going to come from these passage information topics we've already identified. So hopefully by creating this chart and by identifying this information, we're going to be able to quickly identify where all the answers to these questions are located so we don't waste time. So let's go ahead and start off with this first question. Researchers use reverse phase high performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, polar mobile phase and non-polar stationary phase to separate compound 2 from compound 1. Which statement accurately describes this process? Now, right off the bat, I know that this is a basic science question because the passage didn't talk anything about chromatography. However, like I said, it's obviously going to reference a little bit of information in the passage, and I know from my chart that figure 1 talks about compound 1 and compound 2. And in my basic science category over here, I've already identified that compound 1 and compound 2 have hydrophobic groups and polar groups. Now that I'm actually in the question, I'll analyze this a little bit more intently. The difference between compound 1 and compound 2 is really just this group up here. So compound 2 is slightly more polar. Now, going back to this question, if I were to rephrase this simply, it's asking which one of these will come out first. Well, I know that if there is a nonpolar stationary phase, the nonpolar or hydrophobic group is going to stick to the column more tightly, so it's going to come out second. So I know that compound 1 is going to elute after compound 2, or in other words, compound 2 is going to elute first. So now let's go through these answer choices. Increasing the polarity of the mobile phase will decrease the retention time of compound 1 relative to compound 2. So this is actually opposite of what would happen, right? If the mobile phase becomes more polar, that means compound 1 is going to stick more tightly to the column. So in fact, its retention time would increase. So I'm going to say probably not for A. Now for B, compound 1 will elute first because it is more polar than compound 2. So again, we know this to be the opposite is true. Compound 2 is more polar than compound 1. So I'm going to say maybe not here. C, Decreasing the affinity of compound 1 for the stationary phase will decrease its retention time relative to compound 2. So again, this is also the opposite trend. In D, compound 2 will elute first because it does not interact as favorably with the stationary phase as compound 1. So this is exactly what we have identified. I'm going to put a maybe here. I only have one answer choice with maybe, so the answer choice is probably D. Now going on to the next question. Which data suggests that the difference in compound 1 metabolism between the variant and wild type CYP2C9 enzymes are not due to changes in the binding affinity towards compound 1? So right off the bat, I know that this has to be a passage information question because I don't have any prior information about these enzymes, and that's okay. I'm not expected to. So it asks about binding affinity. And what do I know about binding affinity? I know that binding affinity is represented as Km. And if we look in my passage information column, I know that Michaelis-Menten data is listed in table 1. So really, this question is asking, like, what about binding is like, what about this data suggests that the differences are not due to Km? So looking at table 1, if I look at Km, the Km of the wild type and the mutants, they're basically the same, right? They're about the same values and they all lie within each other's confidence interval or error bars. So now let's go through the answer choices. Compound 1 is still eliminated from the body of patients expressing the CYP2C9 star 3 allele. That doesn't have anything to do with binding affinity, so I'm going to probably say maybe not. B, the Km values for the variant enzymes do not differ significantly from the wild type enzyme. So that seems like exactly what table 1 is showing us. So I'm going to put a strong maybe for B. C, the amino acid substitutions at positions 144 and 359 do not change the binding pocket of the variant enzymes. Well, if I look at these substitutions, which are again in table 1, I'm going from arginine to cysteine. Well, I'm going from a positive to basically hydrophobic. That definitely is going to change the binding pocket. But for 359, I'm going from hydrophobic to hydrophobic. So C's wrong, and so I'm going to put probably not here, maybe not. D, the side chains of the amino acid residues at position 144 and 359 are charged at physiological pH. So again, we look here, I know that R will be charged, but I will not. So D, probably not as well. And I'm only left with one maybe, and that's B. And that is most likely the answer choice here. Next question. If the data used to generate kinetic parameters in table 1 were displayed in a Lineweaver-Burke plot, the plot would show that the y-intercept, so again, I've identified immediately that this is a passage information question. It tells me I'm calling from table 1, and I remember from my chart that figure 2 shows this Lineweaver-Burke plot. Now, this question is only asking about the y-intercept, and I can see that the y-intercept here is 1 over Vmax. So if I go over to table 1, I see that I have 3 different Vmax values. So if I take 1 over those, I'm going to get 3 different Vmax values. Or, sorry, 3 different 1 over Vmax values, so 3 different y-intercepts. So A, is the same for all 3 variants? That's unlikely, as we've already explained. B, is the same for the CYP2C9 star 1 and CYP2C9 star 2, but different for CYP2C9 star 3? Again, we know all 3 are going to be different, so probably not. C, is the same for CYP2C9 star 2 and CYP2C9 3, but different for CYP2C star 1? Again, we know that all 3 are going to be different, so probably not. D, is different for all 3 variants? Strong answer. That's what the data suggests. I'm only left with 1, maybe, so I'm going to go with D. And this last question, the overall reaction scheme for enzymes of the CYP450 enzyme family is shown with R representing the substrate. So right off the bat, this is probably a basic science question, right? They give me this little mechanism. It's asking about, look at the answer choices. I'm going to use my background information to solve this, so I'm not going to reference the passage. So it's asking what the function of NADPH is. So I see that NADPH goes from, well, NADPH to NAD+. So I'm losing hydrogen. Now, I know that in the body, when something loses hydrogen, that means it's going to lose an electron as well. And that's how we think of oxidation reduction reactions within the body and within biochemistry. It's gaining or losing hydrogen in its electron. So since NADPH is losing hydrogen, it's being oxidized, which means it's going to be a reducing agent. So A, an oxidizing agent? Probably not. Again, we know it's being oxidized, so it must be a reducing agent. B, a reducing agent? That fits exactly the background knowledge that I know, so I'm going to put maybe here. C, a catalyst? That doesn't really make any sense. Probably not. D, an electrophile? Again, that does not match this reaction scheme, so I'm going to say probably not. So I'm going to say the answer here is probably B, since that's the only maybe I'm left over with. Now, I hope you were all able to see how creating that chart and rephrasing questions made answering these questions very simple and easy. I may not have remembered the details of the passage perfectly, but I knew exactly where to find the information I needed to answer the questions correctly. This is much more efficient, realistic, and simple than trying to remember everything on your first read-through. I hope you found this video informative and useful. If you liked it, go ahead and click the like button and subscribe to my channel for more awesome content. If you have any recommendations on future videos, such as topics or hard passages, you can reach me at themcatguru@gmail.com.